Want to keep your dollars and cents? Then download the Sense app from the Office of Financial Readiness. That's Sense, S-E-N, money sign, E, to save for retirement, build credit, create a spending plan, or buying a home. You can't do any of those things without money. So if you have sense, you'll download the Sense app. That's S-E-N, money sign, E, today. And be sure to follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Rod Rodriguez. This is Military Matters. For the last several weeks on Military Matters, we have been covering China in our Future War series. Then, to put it mildly, Afghanistan went right to hell in a handbasket. The last 2 weeks have been an absolute gut punch to the American people. Service members and veterans have been very vocal about the feelings of defeat and frustration they're experiencing as they watch the Taliban reassume control of Afghanistan, now just weeks away from the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. This week, we were going to release part 3 of our Future War series on China, but after some internal discussions, we decided that another story that we had been working on for next month was a bit more appropriate. We're going to do a fast take, of course, related to this topic of Afghanistan, but then we're going to get right back to our Future War series on China. We appreciate your patience and we encourage everyone to try and keep their heads up through this trying time. Our veterans and service members served with pride and performed valiantly through 2 decades of conflict. So thank you for everything you've done and continue to do. And now, Jack Murphy takes us into this story from the Battle of Kunduz.
As the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, the Taliban swept across the country and seized control of the government. Some Afghan units put up a fight, but most of them folded pretty quickly. The speed in which the country fell to the Taliban shocked the world, including a lot of people who probably should have known better. This would include the U.S. intelligence community, which is already having a public food fight between analysts at the CIA and the Department of Defense. But the notion that the Afghan military would hold against the Taliban was a lie obvious to no one who wanted to believe it. Any soldier or Marine who served on the ground in Afghanistan could have told you as much. A PhD from Georgetown was not required to make such an assessment. The warning signs and indicators were there. For instance, the Battle of Kunduz in 2015 showed how weak the Afghan government was, and that while Afghan special operations units were willing to fight, the conventional Afghan military would not move a muscle without American support. The tragedy we see playing out on the news today played out countless other times on a smaller scale in Afghanistan throughout the 20-year conflict. I first heard the inside story of what happened in Kunduz back in 2015 from reporter Jessica Donati when I read her book about U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan titled Eagle Down. I asked if she would be willing to put me in touch with one of her sources for an interview about the battle. After the Taliban took over Kunduz, a small team of Green Berets and their local partner force waged a heroic effort to take the city back, an effort that resulted in a pyrrhic victory, as it was overshadowed by a terrible friendly fire incident in which an AC-130 gunship blew up a Doctors Without Borders hospital. On this episode, we're going to talk to the Special Forces medic on that mission, Joshua Middleton. Josh grew up in Northwest Arkansas and got a scholarship to study abroad. So in 2003, he packed up and went to Madrid. However, the war on terror caught up with him in some unexpected ways.
So it was nice being at college in Europe because we had normal American spring break, but then the next week it just happened to be Holy Week there in Spain, which is like Semana Santa. It's at the end it closes with Lent. It's like the last day of Lent, and then Easter Sunday at the end of Holy Week. So we had that 2 weeks off from school, and some friends of mine and I went down to the beach in south of Spain, and we were on that train going back into the city, and we got in at like 2:30 in the morning. And then the bomb went off about 7 a.m.
Josh had narrowly avoided the 2004 train bombings in Spain orchestrated by Al-Qaeda.
And I actually got a call from another friend who was like, "Hey, are you watching the news?" And I'm like, "No, I'm asleep. I just got in. I've been partying all week." And he was like, Chocha, the train station was blown up this morning. It was pretty crazy. Going down there and seeing the aftermath, it was like, whoa, wow. And of course, at that time, you know, there's always been the kind of conflict there with ETA and like Northern Spain separatist movement and that kind of stuff. So at first, a lot of people were like, oh, it was ETA. And then, come to find out that, hey, it was, Al Qaeda, associated with like the Moroccan cell and all this stuff. And then I definitely, you could see the same thing that kind of happened in the States, like the anti-Islam, anti-Arab sentiment in the city. I mean, especially because they have a large Moroccan population. It changed really quickly there in the city. Like I had a couple friends from Morocco that were like, scared to go out of their apartments and stuff because it got pretty difficult for them for a little while after that.
Josh already had a brush with terrorism and the resulting anti-Islamic backlash prior to joining the military. But the thing was, college just wasn't jiving with him. He hated it and was bored. Inspired by the soldiers he saw on the news fighting in Iraq, he joined the army. Assigned to the 82nd Airborne, he deployed several times to Afghanistan, where he met a Special Forces team sergeant named Rob Pittman, who told him that he would make a great Green Beret. 3 days later, Pittman was killed in a firefight. Josh dropped his packet to go to the Special Forces Assessment and Selection Program. After extensive training as a Special Forces medic, he was deployed to Tajikistan. His team then immediately flew straight to Afghanistan to find some war action.
We worked at Anasoc SOAG. They're kind of helping run the Commando Corps and run their SF program kind of in its early nascent stages there. But then we started doing some low-vis type stuff into Kabul. And so it was really unique for me, very different than just straight combat in an outpost that I was used to as an infantryman. And also, getting to debrief colonels and generals all the time on different programs that we were running there with the Commandos. And then obviously dealing with some massive budgets and being like, you're going to train all of the Commandos in Afghanistan. And, here's $1 billion to figure it out, Obviously, that's all on paper. I don't think we ever saw any of that money in real life. But,
And then, to their surprise, their ODA got a new mission.
And they're like, hey, you guys are actually going to go train 10th SOC, which is just basically a brand new SOC that they just got people to volunteer from all the other Kandaks to go out to Kunduz. And we're going to send you guys out to Kunduz, and you're actually going to live out there because we don't really need much support for FISOC right now. We need to stand up a brand new Kandak out in Kunduz. So the 7th Group team that we had replaced, they had resisted that move the whole time to permanently live out in Camp Pamir out in Kunduz. So when we got out there, it was just completely undeveloped, right? And I'm not going to blame those guys at all because they resisted going out there because I don't think they understood what the mission was out there, and we didn't really either at the time. So we didn't have a gun truck. We had a heavy weapon out there. We didn't have walls. We didn't have running water. Literally, we took a shower in the broom closet from a water hose and a spigot somebody ordered off Amazon, and we had 2 tactical, non-tactical vehicles, a couple Hiluxes. One was up armored that worked half the time. But obviously nothing to mount a weapon system on. We didn't have any privacy from the Commandos. There was no walls, no separating our camp from theirs. Just from an insider threat type scenario. So we were really like, oh man, we're in the world of hurt right now, right? And at the same time, 10th SOC, they were being sent all over Badakhshan and all over Kunduz area, all up in that northeast side of the country, basically manning checkpoints because nobody really understood how to employ 10th SOC either because they were brand new. They were a brand new Kandak, really just kind of thrown together and kind of bastardized from all the other SOCs, less equipped, brand new commander. So they were really just at the whim of the 209th Army, the Afghan Army Corps that had the main camp there in Kunduz. So we didn't have, when we first got there, we didn't have our commandos the majority of the time. When you want to go train somebody or get them ready for an op, and I go down there to talk to the company commander and I say, hey, we have on the schedule to do range week this week. And they're like, oh, well, they all just got sent to run a checkpoint out in Badakhshan, Oh yeah, they're on leave right now. So there was no red, amber, green. There was nothing. So we didn't have our own equipment. We didn't have our commandos. We didn't have any Afghan SF guys to train at the time. And of course, we were still driving daily down to the airfield just to pull off our water and our fuel to run the two 4K generators that we had just to keep the lights on, So most of what we did at the beginning out in Kunduz was just basic life support tasks,
Why was it so undeveloped like this late in the war?
Well, I think a big part of it was, for so long, that was kind of the Germans and some of our European allies area. And, the Germans had the big issue when they blew up that tanker there outside of Kunduz earlier in the war. And so there was a lot of infrastructure around there, but they had pretty much already given all that stuff over to the Afghans. So the air traffic control tower at the airfield, that was controlled by Afghans. There was like an Afghan police unit that was now in charge of one of the old German camps. And then the 209th Corps, which ran kind of the most exterior perimeter of our little area. It was all Afghan, and it had already all been handed over to the Afghans. I think with the intention of there never being Americans there again,
So you guys come in, you start standing up this new Kandak to the best of your ability, but it sounds like a lot of it was, as you said, just life support, just maintaining yourself in place because there's no logistic infrastructure there.
No logistic infrastructure, tiny space, obviously no commandos to train, no mission for the commandos at the time because of all the authorities and everything like that. I mean, there was no expectation. We legitimately thought that we were going to live out in Kunduz. We left some guys back in Mazar-i-Sharif to kind of run some of the logistics and also keep a touch point with 5th SOC, and kind of be a little closer to like the real world. We hardly had functioning internet out in Kunduz. So we would send guys back for the first about 6 weeks we were there. We were doing a lot of like shuttling guys back and forth, every couple of weeks to Mazar-i-Sharif to try to help either bring supplies to Kunduz or try to figure out what our mission set would look like in Mazar-i-Sharif, what we could do to support 5th SOC. Because, 10th SOC, they weren't combat ready, and they at that point, it didn't seem like we were ever going to do an op in Kunduz.
Josh and his teammates had their work cut out for them. He also decided to outfit a few gun trucks and have them shipped to Kunduz, which turned out to be a wise decision, as you'll soon see. I asked Josh to tell us about how the city eventually fell to the Taliban.
So I think this is kind of where we had a very big gap, right? I think now looking back from historical references and so I think it's funny because you can read The Bear Went Over the Mountain, or you can read the Mujahideen Wars and some of their fights with the Russians. And the first city that the longest city the Afghans held out fighting against the Russians was Kunduz, and then Mazar-i-Sharif being a close second. And the first city that they took from the Russians, or the first city they reestablished control of, was Kunduz, right? And it makes sense. Like when you look at it geographically, it's got a perfect road straight up to Tajikistan. You can take it east through Badakhshan, which is a no man's land, towards Pakistan to secure supply lines coming from there. And then you got a straight shot south to Kabul, and obviously a straight shot west to Mazar-i-Sharif. So at the perfect crossroads to get anywhere in that country that you need to go, and it's logistically sustainable, right? And I don't think we realized that how important Kunduz was from a strategic standpoint in the Taliban's eyes. Obviously, I think, we do now. We did that after that, and then obviously the subsequent year when the same thing happened again to that first group team, or the 10th group team. So when the city started to things started to change, we started to see a dynamic shift there. I remember we had a couple guys on the ground that came to us and said, hey, we think something big is going to happen in the city. It looks like it's going to happen around the holiday, which is perfect for them because, all the military people that are stationed in Camp Pamir, they kick off on holiday and they're going back to Mazar-i-Sharif. They're going up to all the districts to the north. They're going out to Badakhshan. And then they're obviously pushing out all the 10 SOC guys to checkpoints. So if all they had to do was take out all those checkpoints on those four corners surrounding Kunduz, and nobody can get back off a leave. No Afghan security forces can reinforce. So that started early, right? We started seeing or hearing reports of checkpoint attacks and checkpoints way outside on the peripheries of the city being kind of taken over. And then it kind of all dropped like a hammer.
Are you a military spouse? MilSpouse Money Mission educates and empowers those whom service members rely on most. So if you're the household 6, captain of the homestead, leader of the domicile, check out MilSpouse Money Mission from the Office of Financial Readiness. Also, they have an app, Sense app, SEN money sign E, to save for retirement, build credit, create a spending plan, or buying a home. If the last year taught us anything, it was how important it is to save for a rainy day or a COVID year. So if you have any sense, you'll download the Sense app. That's SEN money sign E today. And be sure to follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.
I remember hearing a report like, hey, the Taliban infiltrated the city with about 1,500 fighters. Which we translated that to English to about 300 fighters because it's usually a little overestimated. And then, like, okay, 300 fighters, but there's a lot of Afghans on leave, a lot of military people, a lot of police in the city. The city was just completely vulnerable. So by taking out the checkpoints and then kind of hitting it in one wave from all 4 directions, they squeezed it really fast. In addition to that, I noticed that we started seeing a lot of civilian flights coming out of the airfield. I had never seen a plane besides our planes flying in our resupplies ever leave that airport. And then really about 2 days before Taliban was posting on Twitter and the whole world knew that they had taken the provincial capital city of Kunduz and raised the Taliban flag in the middle of the city, there were planes leaving, UN planes, like planes flying out, a lot of foreign individuals that maybe worked at the MSF hospital. There were people leaving the city a couple of days prior, and that was our first big tip-off. Like, okay, this isn't right. Like, why are all these planes flying out of the city right now? And then, obviously, it all happened kind of like very, very abruptly.
Your ODA, was it even a 12-man team down there? Because you said you were kind of split up.
No. So, no, it wasn't. We were at I would say 9 guys.
So you got 9 Muldoons down here in Kunduz on a training mission to train Kandak Commandos. You guys have no running water, nothing really going on there. You had the foresight a week prior to bring in some gun trucks with some ammunition and some like 240s or 50s on it, right?
Yep.
How in the hell do 9 guys suddenly get this assignment like, hey bros, can you retake this city from the Taliban, please?
Yeah. So we had some Tenth Mountain guys with us, our uplift attachments. So we had a squad of 10th Mountain guys. And then once the city fell, and that's something that Hutch doesn't get enough credit for.
Hutch was Josh's company commander in Charlie Company.
I remember I got a phone call, and it was my old team leader, the one that had gotten fired on the 2014 trip. At that point, he was rear D because he was on his way out to bigger and better things. Decided, all right, that was the straw that brought the camel's back. And he called me because he was the rear D commander for our battalion back at Bragg. And he called me and he said, Josh, what the hell are you guys going to do about this? He knew the situation. He was like, call me. He was like, hey, man, the news is out. Everybody in the world knows what just happened or what's happening right now in Kunduz. Like, what's the plan, man? What's the game plan? And I was like, sir, I don't know. I was like, we're ready to go fight, but we don't have any commandos. We have 4 gun trucks that can hold about 6 guys each max with the ammo. I was like, I don't know. And then Hutch flew in. About 12 hours into the city is fully under Taliban control.
With shit sliding downhill fast in Kunduz, 30 Green Berets, 2 Kandak units, and the Katakas Special Ops Unit were brought in to help fight.
It got interesting because obviously we had never been in the city as an ODA. We hadn't trained TENSOC at all. So when they were like, hey, you guys are going to run tent sock, these other teams are going to run these other elements. I was like, told Hut, I was like, I don't think tent sock is prepared to execute this mission. Like they don't have enough people or training here to go out. So first we decided, okay, tent sock is going to stay back and basically run resupplies into the city as needed. Right. So we're kind of working through our plan. Obviously we got to figure out our authorities. We got to figure out what our ROE is and all that kind of stuff. And at this point, the National Security Advisor is on board and she's talking to us.
That would be Obama's National Security Advisor, Susan Rice. By this point, Josh was on the phone every 5 minutes as special ops teams from around the country wanted to get in on the action and help kick some ass. The problem was that the Taliban literally owned the city at this point and were driving around with tanks. Josh wasn't sure if they had surface-to-air missiles or not, so anyone who came to the party had to drive in. Even before all of this, it wasn't easy to get up to Kunduz on helicopters in the first place. Furthermore, he didn't even have enough vehicles to accommodate more operators. As all of this was happening, Josh received word of a fresh emergency. They were about to lose the airfield to the Taliban. Hutch tells Josh his new mission is to make sure they don't lose the airfield that night.
So I call in all my commandos, and obviously since we were the only team that had driven down that road every day, every other day for the last 6 weeks, I was like, hey, I told Team Sergeant, I was like, hey, I want to plan this op to take the airfield back because I feel like I'm the most familiar with the route, and none of the other teams are that familiar with it. So he was like, cool, I'm good with it. So I went to go brief the commandos, and the idea was you could either go all the way around and stay on hardball, but you kind of would be getting into the area that had just fallen to the Taliban, right? So I was like, all right, we can get bottled up in a gunfight near the edge of the airfield, or we can just off-road it and just beeline straight for the tarmac and just haul ass down the tarmac and just secure the control tower, give us the best vantage point for a CC, for a C2 element, and then kind of push forces out from there and figure out where the hot spots are and just reinforce a perimeter as needed. So I was briefing the commandos and I was just kind of drawing it out literally on the ground with a marker with headlamps, with a stick. And I remember I got a tap on my shoulder, and it was an old Afghan guy, general, I think at the time. I couldn't tell really at the time. I found out later it was the general. And it happened to be the 209th Corps commander. And he was like, hey, I've got a helicopter waiting to take me back to Mazar-e-Sharif. He's like, I recommend you guys just get out. I was like, what are you talking about? He was like, there's no chance that we can stop this. It's inevitable. They're going to take the airfield. And he was like, I'm leaving. I'm taking my guys and we're going home. And I was like, that's not an option for us, man. Like I was flabbergasted, and I was sitting there.
He was willing to give it all up so easy without even firing a shot.
Without one shot fired. And he got on that helicopter and he flew away,
Wow.
And so, I was like, all right, well, back to the mission at hand. We need to go secure that airfield. So that was the big mission at first, and I think having gone out the day prior, like when the city actually fell, and tried to help my interpreter bring his dad and his pregnant wife onto the base so they didn't get killed by the Taliban, I realized at that time when I got kind of that Mexican standoff with all those security forces, that most Afghans, other than the people that worked at the control tower and saw us bringing equipment in and out and flying a bird in and out every few nights to get our fuel and water, most of the security forces in Kunduz have no idea that there's Americans there, right? They had no idea we were there. So when the city fell, there was a lot of animosity when they found out we were around, because they're like, you're not doing anything. What are you going to do to protect our city? It's on you. You shouldn't have let this happen. Like, all of our families are going to get killed by the Taliban, and we're going to get killed by the Taliban. If there's Americans here, why aren't you dropping bombs? Why aren't you fighting, right? Why aren't you defending Kunduz, And when we rolled down to the airfield that night, I will never forget watching, there were scores. I mean, like, I'm talking about 30, 40, 50 Afghan security forces, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, dropping their weapons and running away, like running towards the desert, like towards the open desert on the other side of the tarmac, while we're just getting pelted with fire, you know? And I'll never forget because the Katejas commander was standing out there in the middle of the flight line, grabbing weapons and shoving them in guys' hands and being like, go fight for your country. Like, go fight. Wow. It was intense. I was like, wow, man. Like, these people are legitimately, I mean, they were so overwhelmed and it was so rapid and you know, all the speed, surprise, violence of action was completely on the Taliban side.
At this point, Josh had to make something happen and launches out to prevent the Taliban from capturing the airfield.
Through the rubble and hit the tarmac. And my truck, we pushed all the way forward. We got the C2 element. So we got Hutch, the team leaders, and the team sergeant up in the control tower at the top. We were kind of controlling fire. At the same time, we had Sid Six-Sock back around to that area that was really the straightest shot into the city, which is where we were most concerned about losing that access point because it was the fastest way in or out of the airfield. So we're like, hey, we need to secure that area first, because if we lose the area, then the Taliban can just rush through that main road and, you know, just clear the whole area pretty quick. So we sent Six-Sock that way. And then we were sitting on the airfield and we got a call that Katejas guys were about to lose their northern perimeter on the northern side of the airfield. So I reached out to my team sergeant. I was like, hey, you know, can I move my gun truck over there and reinforce the Katejas guys securing those guard towers? So we moved over there, got out with the Katejas guys. At that point, we had a bunch of aircraft on station, so we were able to start actually having some effects on targets. Took out 3 or 4 different ZPUs that had set up, just hammering us. Like, so the lucky thing that we had was that the airfield is about 150 meters higher than everything else in the city. So it's a little plateau on the southern edge of the city, the southeastern edge of the city of Kunduz. So we got to fire down on them for the most part, right? So that, I think, saved our ass, because the only way that they could have gotten up from those little small kind of satellite villages outside on the outskirts was to climb up the side of that kind of bluff, right? So if it had been a straight shot, we would have lost that airfield a lot easier, or it would have been a lot more difficult to defend it. But we got there, we started having some effects, we started being able to see where they were firing from. So we called some munitions, called some aircraft. I know one of the dudes from 3-3 was just going crazy with the 60 handheld, just going wild. And I remember looking off to my side, and I saw a bunch of like plainclothes Afghans, like in fighting positions, you know, firing down off the plateau into the villages where we're taking fire from. And I grabbed the Katejas commander and I was like, hey, who are those guys? They're not in uniform. Like, who are they? Because we need them to keep doing what they're doing, and I need more of them, right? I need more people to help fight, right? And the Katejas commander was like, let me go ask him. So he goes walking over there, and I remember it was like this really tense moment, because I walked over there, and he was like, no, stay away. Like, push, you know, don't come over here. And at first I was like, man, who are these guys? And to this day, I don't know. I have theories and speculations, but I do know that they weren't too happy to see Americans. But they also weren't too happy with the Taliban. So
Josh never found out for sure who they were, but he suspects that they may have been foreign fighters or local militia who split with the Taliban over some local grievances that he was unaware of. At that point, it really didn't matter as long as they were shooting at the Taliban. Next, Josh went to take over the other side of the airfield and found a pretty shocking scene.
So we got back in our truck, and I remember driving back down the main road, and I was in the truck, and I remember seeing Afghan security forces, different types of people poking their heads up from behind their HESCO little compounds there along the airfield. And I'm like, man, like, these guys aren't fighting. Like, why aren't they fighting? Like, why are they hiding in their compounds? And that's when I was like, hey, you know, I think they need to see us. So I asked myself and I asked my Charlie, I was like, hey man, I need you to walk in front of the truck with me. And I got our interpreter, and I just started yelling into the compounds. I started banging on the compound doors and saying, hey, get out and fight. Come fight with us. We're not going to leave. Like, we're here to fight. Like the Americans are here. Like, we want to fight. We're not going to lose the airfield. Come fight with us. Right. And I remember we got on the backside with our gun trucks, and I looked into one of the compounds, and there was like a row of 11 Afghan gun trucks all lined up, unmanned, inside a compound. And I remember banging on the door, yelling at them, bring your gun trucks out here and fight with us, right? And finally somebody came to answer the door, and it was the commander. And he was like, "Oh, the Americans are here." Like, he's like, "Are you fighting with us? Or are you leaving?" And I was like, "No, we're fighting. We're here to stay. We're going to fight. We're going to take the city back. But we need more people. We need more bodies." And he's like, "I'm going to get my guys in the gun trucks." And finally, I had a convoy of 11 gun trucks come secure our perimeter for us.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was pretty intense. I was like, man, like, I don't know what it was. Like, I mean, it was the psychological freeze that they had experienced, man. Like, I had never seen up to that point. Obviously this, Afghans, just like anywhere else, just like Americans, they run the full gambit of people, but at that point, I think there was so much hopelessness that on the Afghan side. And I can only imagine that's probably how a lot of them feel now, with the full withdrawal. It was just this sense of hopelessness, right? Like, they weren't scared. They were just hopeless.
The next obstacle to overcome was a Taliban tank driving around the city.
Actually, at that point, they were driving around with a tank. I don't think they knew how to shoot it, right? The Taliban. I don't even know if they had ammo or whatever, but they're just driving around, just like destroying like buildings and compounds. They're just running stuff over, right? And I remember, we were literally tracking a lot of these guys on like their social media and stuff, right? Like, they're posting this stuff like on Twitter. And we finally got the B-2 out. They flew in the B-2 from Iraq, and they're like, "Hey, you got a B-2 on station. Like, let's get this going," right? And they're like, "We're going to take out that tank." But the first time they got images on the tank, they were literally, I saw the picture, and it was the tank parked, and there was like a tarp hanging down off the side of the tank, and it looked like somebody had a dugout right underneath kind of like the side of the tank treads. And they're like, "Hey, we can't drop on that. That looks like a structure, like a dwelling." And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" So I would say Colonel Johnson fought that one like tooth and nail for a while. Like, it took us a good 4 hours to like actually get the authority to go ahead and destroy that tank.
It's a
with
tank.
hard times. Yeah, a tank.
It's not a home. It's not a home
under
for
Taliban
civilians.
control. Under Taliban control, a tank. I'm like, all right, well, I guess we're let the bureaucracy do its magic, but.
After the B-2 came in and destroyed the tank, the tone of the battle shifted from the U.S. perspective.
I think that probably was the tipping point where I think the higher command and, even up, the higher echelons of our commanders on the ground in Afghanistan, as well as like at the national strategic level, being like, "Hey, like, we don't have an advantage right now, and they have all the momentum. And to regain the momentum, we're going to have to take the gloves off, and we're going to have to fight these guys like now. We've got to do something ASAP." And I remember before that second night, before we went back into the city, Hutch was like, "Hey, the gloves are off. The president's telling us that the city is a free fire zone. Like, we need to take the city back, right? Like, there is no other option. Like, obviously do everything we can to minimize every type of damage possible. But if we don't take the city back, like, the entire mission is lost." Like, they were talking at the time, the president's telling, "Hey, I'm on the verge of saying that the Ghani administration was incapable of defending the country," right? It was like getting it to the point where like our president was going to tell their president that, "Hey, maybe you should look for a new job," kind of thing, So I was like, whoa, this is getting pretty serious, right? Like,
now they just had to retake the city. Piece of cake, right?
The original plan obviously went out the window when we were like, we're going to split the city up into like two main corridors and hit both roads at once. Because when we took the airfield, we saw that back road that we ended up securing at the end of the night. And we're like, maybe that's the best way into the city, right? And so we had our different elements set up. We had Katejas out front, and then it was my gun truck. And I will give the guys in 3-3 credit. A couple of guys in 3-3 were going to ride a side-by-side, open air side-by-side with 240 mounted on one side. They're like, "Oh, we're going to go out lead into the city." I was like, "Dude, you are not going lead truck in a side-by-side, man. Like, it's not happening, dude." And like, so we fought back and forth about that for a little while. And I was like, "Dude, I got a minigun, man. Let me go out and lead with the minigun," So the plan was basically we were going to kind of all go in one long convoy and then hit our major targets, right? So we had a prison that we wanted to get to. There was a police headquarters. So we had the special police unit attached to us. So special police were going to secure the police unit, and they were going to kind of peel off the back of the convoy. And we were just going to keep pushing as fast as we could into the city. And then the rear elements were just going to pull off from the rear and kind of banana peel out, secure their sectors. And then we'll all link up at the end during daylight. And hopefully, inshallah, everything will be good, So as we're doing that, it kind of dawned on us that like there wasn't a lot of good reason to split the elements up into different parts of the city, and that our better chance was to get to the middle of the city and kind of work from our inside out, kind of like this, get to the inside of the onion and just kind of create layers as we could, right? So I remember Hutch coming over the net, and since I was up front, he was like, "Hey, Josh, your only job is to keep pushing. You got to keep us pushing, go into the middle of the city as fast as we can, right?" Because by the time we got into the city, they had already set up barricades. They had like burning cars and wire across the road to try to, to funnel us off the road, to slow us down, to get us into ambushes. We hit a few IEDs in the route. And every time we hit an IED, we started an ambush, or the aircraft would call and say, "Hey, you got enemy maneuvering towards your position right now after the IED strike." I would have to get the Catejas guys to load back up in their truck. I'm like, "Hey, we're going to let the aircraft take care of the ambush. We're just going to keep going. We're just going to blow through all the ambushes. We hit an IED, just keep moving. Hit an IED, just keep moving. Because if we stop, we're never going to make it to the middle of the city, because there's no telling how many IEDs, how many barricades, how many different positions they have set up for us to basically lull us into a long, drawn-out fight, right?
Right.
So that was hard. That was challenging because, especially from the Afghans' perspective, because every time we would hit something up front, I would have to run up there and be like, "Hey, we got to keep moving. We got to keep moving. I know you want to fight through this ambush, and I know you want to maneuver on these guys." I was like, "But we don't have the time to maneuver. Like, time is not our friend right now. We have to get to the middle of the city."
Sounds like Mad Max.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy. Like, I mean, I've never seen, I guess, and just the sheer luck that we had from hitting. I mean, so my truck never hit any because we had two Catejas trucks in front of us, and then they had a Land Cruiser in front of us. But we had a V-bid hit us on one side. We had a couple IEDs hit us almost at turret level. They had run wire across like through some of the compounds in the second-story buildings so that our antennas would hit the wire and set off IEDs at like turret level. But at the time, because we were dropping bombs danger close to the convoy as we screamed through the city, all the Afghans had their turrets locked. So a lot of times they roll the turret open, so they can see, manipulate their guns. But because we weren't fighting, we weren't engaging as much from the vehicles, we were just trying to push through as fast as possible. They had locked the turrets. They weren't hanging out above, because if they had their turrets open, I mean, at least one Afghan gun truck would have been taken out by those IEDs, So it's just some sheer luck and just like a lot of serendipity that nobody was injured on infill, So we knew in general where the provincial governor's mansion was, right? And so our idea, middle of town, if we can get to the provincial government, seat of government, at least that will be like a good starting point, right? Let's aim for that. But when we got there, first we thought it was this hotel that we hit. So we cleared the hotel. And then one of the other teams, the guys from 3-5 were like, "Hey, here's a secure compound next to the hotel. Maybe this is it." So they went ahead and charged it, went in, breached it and cleared it. And we're like, "Yeah, this has got to be it." But it ended up being the PCOP. It ended up being like the police chief's headquarters. And the provincial governor's mansion and living quarters with that was actually just down the hill about like 400 meters from us. But it was actually convenient that we had taken that, because where the PGov was at was kind of in a little depression. And I mean, it was just like, it would have been a fishbowl, especially because a lot of the higher buildings all around that area, they could have just shot down on us. At least at the PCOP, it was at street level, and we were at least a little bit of elevation, almost equivocal to what they would be at street level. If we had stopped at the P-Govs initially and we had stuck to that original plan, like it would have been very hard to defend that position.
Jeez.
So we just got lucky. I mean, it was like a lot, I'll tell you, a lot of luck.
They make it through the night, but then by that morning,
about an hour and a half, 2 hours into it, at daybreak, so about 7:30, 8:30 in the morning, we just started getting hammered from like all sides, right? And like it was just this deluge of stuff, right? We were getting hit. So the first guys that I engaged were wearing police uniforms, right? But they're setting up a PKM across the street from us, shooting from the second story of like a shop, and they were shooting at us. So obviously, you know, we're going to go ahead and engage, but they were wearing police uniforms, you know? It's like, that was when we were like, hey man, like I don't know what the enemy is going to look like out here. All I know is that anybody shooting at us at this point forward is an enemy, because they've raided all these police headquarters. They had already ransacked the PCOP. And, you know, a lot of the police had abandoned their posts, or they were in civilian clothes on leave and they never made it back into the city. So they had left their uniforms at their different checkpoints that the Taliban all now controlled, you know? So they had all their equipment, they had their gun trucks, they had their weapons, they had their clothes, they had everything. So we started getting hit really hard from our immediate vicinity, right? So like this right across the streets from the PCOP, right? Basically split the city, the main road in half. I mean, they were shooting at us from across the street, like 20 meters away from inside compounds and stuff. So the first day of fighting was very much us in the towers and then trying to fight them off in our immediate vicinity, right? So trying to get enough white space to at least push out, right? And then our plan was that, hey, if we can fight off their waves of attacks, then at night, we're obviously going to be able to gain ground on them, right? You can go in and clear all this stuff, clear out these compounds, clear out some of these side streets leading towards the center of the city. And I mean, obviously for me, having not understand the full strategic implications, and Jessica talks about a lot in the book, and not understand that we were kind of directed, and that Hutch was obviously playing the smart move and saying, hey, the Kitejas guys, our commandos, they're going to be really our action force, right? We've only got 30 Americans and some Romanians, and we don't have the wherewithal to secure a strong point and start doing clearing ops, but we've got our Kitejas, the best of the best in the Afghan commandos. We're going to use them at night to start doing clearing ops. So we would send them out every night, and the commandos would start clearing first close to us, kind of build us some white space, and then the next night build us some more white space. So they were really the main effort for clearing the city, right?
this goes on for days, with the Afghan commandos putting up a hell of a fight. So walk me through this a little bit. That you sent, they went to go clear a NDS, being the Afghan intelligence service, had a prison somewhere in the town. You sent these guys to go clear it and get the Taliban the hell out of there. If you walk me through a little bit of what led up to this accident that led to the bombing of the Doctors Without Borders hospital.
Yeah. So it kind of all it helps some with some of the context too, because so obviously morning of day one, we do our night infill. It's day one, or really morning of day two at this point, right? We're getting hit from all sides. We're just getting hammered, right? And then we kind of fight them off. We do immediate clearing around our immediate area, around the compound that night. Then the morning of day three, we start getting hammered more. And at this point, we're getting hammered more from the east side of the city, right? From the outskirts, a little further back, right? A little we have reports of hey, they're coming in on gun trucks. They're flying Taliban flags on GMVs, Afghan GMVs. They're driving around on motorcycles. I've seen them doing medevac with vehicles that they had taken from the MSF, right? Like MSF, UN vehicles driving around, men, weapons, and equipment on the battlefield in commandeered MSF vehicles and UN vehicles and Land Cruisers and stuff like that. So it was very difficult to say, okay, what is the level of threat that this person or this vehicle or this entity is poses to us right now? Because they had a full run of the city until we came in there, right? So they could have taken any number of things from any number of people that were in that city beforehand, right? And they were using it to their advantage, right? So we were taking a lot of fire from that northeast side of the city on the second day, right? But slowly over the course of that day and then into the next day, a lot of the enemy fighting and a lot of where the enemy seemed to be coming from was towards that NDS headquarters and towards where the area was by the MSF hospital, right? Like that seemed to be the main focal point of the enemy's kind of like combat power. That's where they were coordinating all their attacks from. That's where their guys were going to and from. And we were getting that a lot from the aircraft too. Like this area was very, very busy. And this was the area where we felt like the majority of the fighters were now coordinating the attacks from, right? Where at first it was very diffuse. It was they're hitting us from 360 degrees, all sides. Everything was an avenue of approach on us, right? Where by day 3, day 4, it had shifted to that kind of focal part of the city was kind of like the last holdout of the city, the last area of the city where we felt like there was the most enemy, right? So we're like, hey, we need to get them into that area of the city at night to figure out what it looks like, right? What we're dealing with and what's going on, and I don't know how much stock to put into it because, having gone to Afghanistan so many times to hear, all the different reports in the telephone game with intel reporting and all that stuff. But our people on the ground were saying the same thing, like, hey, there's Pakistanis there near the NDS compound, near that whole area by the MSF hospital, mostly in that NDS compound. Like that's their command node. They've got heavy weapons on top of the buildings. That's where their main focal point is, right? So that's why we made the decision to ask the Tejas to go into that area at night. It's very hard for me to say because obviously having not been the guy on the ground with the Tejas to say what building was or wasn't being fired at, where the enemy was or wasn't on the battlefield in the battle space, I do know with 100% certainty that the area around that hospital and that NDS compound right across the street was not friendly. It was not under neutral or friendly control, right? That the enemy owned that battle space, right? Whether they owned it directly, like they had control of the hospital, that they infiltrated the hospital, or they just had the area around that hospital. I don't know. I don't know. I know what MSF says. I know what the Afghans have said in the past. I know all that stuff. I've read all the reporting and all that stuff. All I know as a guy on the ground that was our best, quickest way to end that fight in Kunduz was to send those guys in that direction, right? And unfortunately, that hospital was in the middle of that space, right? And so one great thing, and I hate that so much of it fell on Ben Vance, like in the book, as the SOTAC on duty that night when that attack happened on the hospital, because we actually did have, so 3-5 brought out their JTAC, 3-3 brought out their combat controller, better word, their combat controller, and we had our combat controller. So we had 3 Air Force combat controllers on the ground with us the entire time, which thank God, because it had like 7 layers of air at some points, We had 3 JTACs and the SOTAC. So, but because we didn't have any batteries left, and obviously we're 4 days into fighting, so these guys are rotating out the night shifts, right? So Ben was like, it was just his shift to provide aircraft coordination and coverage for the Tejas mission to go clear that NDS headquarters and the NDS compound. So it could have been any one of those guys, right? Any one of those. It could have just been him that drew the straw that night, and I don't think it would have changed anything on the outcome. It just happened to be Ben on the radio that night talking to the aircraft when, the strike happened. So I remember sitting there and I was sitting right next to their truck. And I was trying to sleep, but I'm not very good at that in those situations. So I'm just kind of sitting there and I'm just listening to him. And I hear him, hey, we're going to call in the strike, right? And he woke up another one.
On the NDS prison.
Right, yeah, on the Indians, on the target that the Kiteos guys had been identifying, right? And from what we knew on the ground, with not having any Blue Force tracking capabilities and it being far enough away that we don't have direct line of sight. In general, geospatially, I knew, they knew, we all knew where they were at in the city, but I couldn't say pinpoint location. Hey, we just didn't have that pinpoint location, right? And so we're like, hey, this is the structure, this is the building, this is the primary target that we're targeting them to hit. And then obviously in the whole communication and all in the report and everything, the building was misidentified and misdescribed. Obviously not having line of sight plays a huge role in the inability to perfectly paint the picture to the ground. But obviously the aircraft got fired at. They took a surface-to-air missile, so they had to bank and then go to a higher elevation. So they already were flying higher than they normally would to do ground identification. And then obviously all their systems failures and everything like that, that all came out in the report. So I think it was just a perfect mix of a lot of different independent variables that led to it. So the next morning after the attack, so the attack was like, I know there's an exact number. I think it was like 4 a.m., right? I want to say 2 a.m., but maybe it's like 2 and 4 in the morning at some points when we did the attack, right? On the hospital. But I remember the next morning as the sun was coming up, we've been in the city for 4 days and it's dead except for all the bodies in the street, like the Taliban, all that stuff. I mean, there was dudes like just humped over PKM or, dead dudes humped over their PKMs in the middle of the street, It was literally like a fishbowl at times, right? They were just hitting us with waves and waves of guys, and then we'd take them out, and then that's their bodies would just be laying there. But at that moment, on the morning of that 5th day, after the strike in the hospital, I remember looking out from my guard position, and I started seeing motorcycles and like women, and like I remember seeing shop shutters opening, right? And I was like, and this is weird, And then like all of a sudden there's all these people at the gate and they're like civilians. And one of this guy's like, I'm a journalist. Like the Taliban left the city. They abandoned the city. Like we got the city back. We won. And all these people are like rushing us. And they're like, hey, you won. Like we won. We did it. Like the city's clear. Like the Taliban left, right?
Josh's thesis may be a controversial one. I'm not aware of any proof that destroying the hospital that night scared the Taliban off, but I suppose it has to be considered as a possibility.
I will never say the end justifies the means, because that's too simplistic of a term, right? That's too simple way to say that for a very complex thing where people died, innocent people that don't deserve to die on all sides of it. But from a personal perspective, and from what I saw from the Afghans that morning, is that whatever happened at 4:30 a.m. was enough to break the will of the enemy, that the people in the city were celebrating and cheering and showing up at our gate at 7:30 in the morning to celebrate the fact that Taliban had left the city, right? I don't think that whatever happened at the hospital, I don't know what else for an outcome, what other outcome that we would have been able to achieve had we done it any other way, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I hate that the system, all the things that we should mitigate and all the things that we have to mitigate in the future is true and relevant and real, and it's important, right? But that act secured that city, right?
Well, how did I understand everything up to that moment, but that one strike on the hospital, I mean, how did that secure the city?
I don't know. I don't know, right? Like, so there was a Vice News interview a few weeks after that came out, and they had gone out to talk to some of the Taliban fighters. And the Taliban fighters said, well, we had to leave the city, right? We were forced to leave the city because it became apparent that that they were going to destroy the city before they let it fall, right? Before we could secure victory, that they were going to, the Americans and all everybody, where they were going to destroy the city, right? So we had to leave to save the city, right? That's the Taliban's argument, right? Was that we had to leave so the city would be saved. My perspective and the perspective of all the Afghans that I engaged and talked to after that, in that moment, felt like whatever it was enough to break the will of the enemy.
And it should be noted, not that this justifies bombing a hospital, but the Doctors Without Borders they treat anybody, including the Taliban were being treated there at times. Do you think that, that had something to do with it, that they were like, whoa, the Americans are so serious, they're willing to blow up a freaking hospital where our guys are being treated?
I definitely think from their perspective, yes. Obviously, that never our intent and purpose was never by it, but that was never like, hey, like this is we're going to make a strategic decision or operational decision to do this thing, right? And it was just a fallout from this bad thing that happened. Did have, without sounding like just super callous and just messed up in the head, it had some positive outcome, right? Like it had a little bit of positive outcome. It saved the rest of that city, right?
It scared the bad guys.
Yeah, it's and I think part of it, yes, that they, and even Jessica talks about it a little bit in the book, and it was something unique that I had never keyed in on or that I knew about. But she talks about how that Taliban commander had come to the MSF hospital, before we ever came into the city, and was like, hey, keep the hospital open, keep it running. Yeah. And I'm going to leave my guy here so that to make sure that it stays open, right? Like, we're going to keep you safe. We're going to protect you. Keep it open, right? So I think it's interesting that the Taliban saw that as a strategic advantage or an operational advantage to them to have a facility in the city where they could take wounded. And this is not a ding on MSF whatsoever, right? Like, it's not saying that they should somehow magically abandon all their principles and their morals and their ethics. But I do think that the Taliban saw that as a strategic advantage that they had in a city. If they could have somebody outside of their organization provide medical care to their fighters, that's a pretty big incentive for that low-level fighter to keep fighting.
And I mean, how did you feel, and how did your guys feel when, of course, the narrative after all of this didn't become, a handful of tough men defend the city and drive the Taliban off? The narrative became, there were some outlets were calling you guys war criminals.
I understand why they would think that, right? And I understand that perspective. I can appreciate that understanding of it, right? Especially given the situation, right? Like, all of a sudden the hospital gets blown up and now the city saves and the Taliban abandoned, all this stuff. All those things can definitely look a certain way, especially if you can control the narrative, right? If you can say, hey, this is our narrative, we're sticking to it. Like, if you only read and only look at that narrative, I don't think you could come to any other conclusion, but we are war criminals, right? So anybody that felt that way, if they want to read that narrative and focus themselves in on that singular point of view, then,
and I remember, being on the outside looking in, that, just as a person reading the news when this unfolded at the time, we didn't hear anything about this heroic defense of the city. We heard about the bombing of the hospital, and that was really the only thing we heard about.
Yeah.
And the way when you hear it isolated of the context, it almost sounds like you guys were just kind of like rolling out on a routine mission, and you screwed up and blew up screwed up, or did it even worse, did it intentionally,
right?
And dropped a bomb on a hospital. But when you listen to the guys who were there, including everything you've told me today, so a very different picture emerges.
Oh yeah, and that was one of the things that I think. Obviously this is huge, long, and this huge investigation immediately, right? So the Afghans did their investigation, but then they also sent in the actual investigators from the Pentagon, right? So we had I think we had 8 stars. I know it's probably 2 3-stars and a 2-star. So whatever that is, 8 stars. Yeah, 8 stars on the ground investigating us, right? About 2 or 3 weeks after everything. And I remember going into the Peacock, and I remember talking to the general. Well, first we had an earthquake, which was wild. We had an earthquake in the middle of Kunduz, and it was huge. And I didn't know what was going on. I was like, we're having a freaking earthquake, man. And these generals were like, what the crap is going on? But so we had the earthquake, and then we're sitting there, and we're trying to walk them through. Hutch is walking them through kind of point by point. This is what happened here. This is where we're at. This is where we're at, and kind of in the story, in the timeline. And like, they're climbing up in the guard towers and trying to see what our line of sight looks like from different areas and trying to piece everything together. But I remember that the chief of police of Kunduz came, and he was standing there next to one of the generals, and he was in tears, and he was just like beside himself. And he looked at the general, and he wrapped his arm around me, like grabbed me by the shoulder, and was like, were you in the city? Did you come to the city when it fell? And I was like, yeah, I was one of the guys fighting in the city. And he looked at the general, and he patted me on the chest and said, he saved Kunduz. They saved Kunduz. Without them, we wouldn't have a city. We wouldn't be standing here today, right? And he was crying, right, while he said this. When we went to the hospital, there were people outside the hospital cheering us, right? And I'm not saying they were cheering us because we blew up a hospital, right? That's not. But the understanding from an Afghan, and I can't say I'm Afghan from the perspective, but I do know is that whatever else, all things looked at in a holistic manner, that regardless of what happened at that moment, whatever it was that happened at that moment, the Afghans, even in the city, viewed that as, hey, like, it could have been a lot worse, right? We could have been out there for 10 days fighting, right? We could have been out there for the whole city could have been destroyed. It could have been a lot worse. Right. It could have been a lot worse than that. And it could have lasted a lot longer, and a lot more people could have died. Does that mean that that's a slippery slope of, okay, well, we just can bomb hospitals now at willy-nilly? No, absolutely not. But I will say that if there is any silver lining to this entire situation, it's that the Afghans didn't suffer even more.
Josh, I really appreciate you sharing this whole story with me today and sharing it with our audience, that a lot more people are going to learn, what it was really like over there that day, and maybe gain some greater appreciation and understanding for the entire conflict, the last 20 years. I guess the last question, I'll leave you with is, your thoughts and your feelings about this withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, there was another siege of Kunduz beforehand, not long after.
Yeah.
Now we're seeing district after district fall to the Taliban. Today, you're out of the military, you're going to college, you're going to school to be a physician's assistant, all these great things. But like many other Afghan veterans, you're watching what's unfolding in Afghanistan right now. And I just really like to hear, a few of your thoughts.
I think for me personally, it's like I know from selfish Josh perspective is that there was a time in the not too distant past, especially being in Afghanistan and seeing young soldiers over there, and I'm like, man, you weren't even born before 1911 or 9/11, right? I'm like, you weren't even alive when 9/11 happened, right? And I guess I never thought in a million years that I would go to a war zone and I might be at risk of seeing my son in that same combat theater someday, right? Like simultaneously, right? Like I went to Afghanistan the first time as a 21-year-old kid, and the thought that I might someday be in Afghanistan with my son, like, and that be a real possibility was kind of mind-blowing, right? Like it was like, whoa, like that's kind of messed up, So from a personal, selfish Josh perspective, having buried so many guys and good people that died there, Americans, I'm glad that no more Americans potentially have to die over there, but I also think that there's obviously a lot of Afghans that saved my life a few times that may have to die as well, now that it's a Taliban fight, right? I think the one thing that I would love to see with the drawdown is that they have a comprehensive system in place to secure all the people that worked with us in that 20 years, whether it's our interpreters, whether it's the people that we contracted with to, clean out our porta-johns, take out our trash, cook our food, all the Afghans that supported us for the last 20 years and all the Afghans that basically made us sustained, I know me personally, and saved my life more than a number of occasions. I don't know how many times I've had my interpreter pull me off to the side and be like, Josh, you can't do that, or Josh, you can't say that, or Josh, that's that cord in the ground, like that's an IED. I don't know how many times that's happened in my time in Afghanistan, to think that we don't owe a huge debt as a military and as a nation to all the Afghans that not only fought beside us, but the Afghans that volunteered and put their families' lives on the line for the last 20 years to work side by side with us to fight, So I think that's the one thing that I genuinely hope. I mean, as far as the geopolitical implications and some of the ramifications, you talked about it with the China stuff before. I think that there are some. I don't think that Afghanistan is going to bury an empire like it did, the Russians. I always say like the graveyard of empires. I think it's going to take a long time for us as a nation to really process Afghanistan. I mean, we were there for 20 years and we were in Vietnam a lot less time, and we still haven't processed that yet. There's a lot of open wounds still left unhealed from Vietnam. So I think that there's a lot to process in the full spectrum of what it means to withdraw from Afghanistan. But I know for me personally, in the short term, short-sighted Josh says, hey, I would love to know that the Afghans that have done so much for me personally, that they're safe,
For many of us, the struggle is over trying to make sense of what has happened in such a short amount of time. I've had this discussion with several people who've told me, hey, you knew the Afghan National Army couldn't hold the Taliban at bay without the US. Why are you so upset? I suppose I hoped. I think we all hoped that maybe they would turn it around. Maybe they'd be better than we thought they were. We saw the good and the bad, and hoped that the good might just be enough. At the end of the day, many of us are sitting on the sidelines, watching, angry, yelling into our social media streams, and witnessing the collapse of 20 years worth of effort. The consolation that we did what we could doesn't help, and at times feels condescending. I don't know where we go from here. No one seems to have any answers. No one seems to have any real plan except to now try and get Americans out of Afghanistan. And that mission has already turned into a bitterly argued point of contention that for some has more to do with election season than it does about getting real people out of real danger. Whatever you're going through personally, seriously, try to keep your head up. And if you feel yourself slipping into despair, call someone, family, friends. Hell, shoot us an email at militarymatters@stripes.com. We'll listen. But you can also call the National Suicide Hotline at 1-800-273-8255. That war has taken enough lives. Let's not give it another. Folks, you can find me on Twitter at RodPodRod. You can find Jack at JackMurphyRGR. And of course, Military Matters has its own Twitter at StripesMMPod. This podcast goes through word of mouth, so be sure to like, listen, subscribe, and share this podcast. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
This was Military Matters. We'll see you at the next episode. Want to keep your dollars and cents? Then download the Sense app from the Office of Financial Readiness. That's Sense, S-E-N, $E, to save for retirement, build credit, create a spending plan, or buying a home. You can't do any of those things without money. So if you have sense, you'll download the Sense app. That's SEN $E today. And be sure to follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.